Now you're
So
on. Now
good.
you're being recorded. Awesome. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know we'll have some more folks jumping in as we go, but we have a really great conversation set up. So I want to make sure we have some time for you all to hear from our wonderful panelists. So welcome to our conversation. My name is Kristen Wright. I serve as the Director of Civic Engagement here at George Mason University. And I'm really, really excited to be joined by Dr. Jeremy Mayer and Dr. Jennifer Victor for our conversation around possible outcomes of the presidential election. The significance of this year's election certainly can't be overstated, and also takes place, as we all know, with the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic and our long overdue racial reckoning. All of this combined with so many of the what ifs that are surrounding the election, from rhetoric we're hearing and things that we've all seen in the media, I think led us to wanting to have this critical conversation to provide a space for our student population to learn a little bit more about what are all the what ifs. So as I said, when we think of some folks at Mason who can speak to this, Dr. Jennifer Victor and Dr. Jeremy Mayer are two folks who come to mind. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, but I won't take up too much time because I want to get to our conversation. But I'll tell you a little bit about them before we get started. Dr. Jennifer Victor studies the US Congress, legislative organization and behavior, social network methods, political parties, campaign finance, organized interest groups, and lobbying. She's the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook on Political Networks and has published extensively in many of the premier political science journals. She also serves on the board of the Center for Responsive Politics and is a past chair of the National Capital Area Political Science Association and a past American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow. Dr. Jeremy Mayer studies American government and politics, elections, foreign policy, media politics, public opinion, and racial politics. He speaks regularly to State Department groups from all over the world, some of which have included Moldova, Germany, and Mexico. And he used to train diplomats for the Foreign Service Institute in a course he co-taught and co-designed. Dr. Mayer has offered political commentary to major networks, including World News Tonight, BBC, PBS NewsHour, NPR, CNBC, and local affiliates, as well as national newspapers.
When they can't get Jennifer, they call me.
Well, I know you've both been so busy with media requests and things, and so we're really, really grateful that you have time to spend with us tonight. As I shared with as our panelists know, this is going to be a conversation really between them about some of the what ifs. And so I'm going to pose a few, they may pose a few to each other, and we invite you all to use the chat box to share some of the things that are on your mind, questions that you have about possible outcomes, what happens if kind of scenarios. So please feel free to use the chat box for any questions that you have as well. I will start by asking each of our guests to talk a little bit about, we'll start strong, I guess, with what's one sort of scary thing or one thing that is a possible outcome of this election that keeps you, if not up at night, maybe has you lose a little bit of sleep, or is really something that's been on your mind recently.
You first, Jennifer.
Sure. I have to go first. I think you should go first. You asked for this question.
All right. So here's the scary thing that keeps me up at night. I'm so afraid that there's going to be such a lawyer Armageddon, that so many states will be tied up in court with injunctions and stop the counts and keep the counts going under different standards in different counties, that we will have a number of states that are at the Florida situation that'll make 2000 look like a bad night at the PTA. And I know a lot of people are already talking about this, but it's worth saying there have been, by some reports, already 300 lawsuits relating to some aspect of voting, and we haven't even got to Election Day. Imagine how many we could have if there are close outcomes. And given the polarization in American politics, there's going to be two huge differences between this and 2000. One, the incumbent. People forget what Clinton did in 2000. It was one of his finest moments as president, and that is that he kept saying, calm down, there's a process, we'll work this out, have faith. This year, the incumbent will be actively pouring gasoline on whatever embers of discontent emerge. And the second thing is that as polarized as we were in 2000, we were less polarized than today. So the hatred and the bile and the toxicity, no one is going to be willing to be the compromiser. It's very unlikely that we'll have an Al Gore type speech on December 12th, 2000, one of his finest moments, when he said, I disagree with the court. I think it was the wrong decision, but I respect the court's decision. I know that Trump could never give that speech. And I wonder if in this environment, Biden could give that speech.
Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to be thinking about that scenario you just painted. But let me tell you about my own scenario that's been in my head that keeps me up at night sometimes, or that I lose a little bit of sleep out. But let me preface it by saying, I think the nightmares are for me at least, unlikely scenarios. Like I think there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of things that could happen at this point. Some of them are quite scary and bad. But I don't think the scariest and worst ones are the ones that are most likely. Like I do try to recenter myself almost on a daily mantra type basis with focusing on the sort of Occam's razor, like the simplest outcome, like the most likely thing is the thing that usually happens. The PTSD that a lot of people have from 2016 is that our expectations were set for a different outcome than what we got. And so I think a lot of us are sort of reliving that experience as we approach Election Day in 2020. That said, my nightmare scenario involves a Biden win in which on election night, enough states are called that Biden gets really close to 270, but doesn't quite cross the threshold. And the states that are just sort of slow to count, but likely to go Democratic, such as Pennsylvania and Wisconsin specifically, maybe even Virginia, are just slow. And people assume they're going to go Biden because of the polling and whatnot and exit polls and everything else, but it's not called for Biden. And so you wind up in this weird situation where you've got a couple of days to wait. And in those days, most people who are sort of reading the numbers and being good faith analysts assume that Biden will win, but it hasn't been declared. And everybody agrees that it hasn't been declared and it's not official. And Trump uses that time to stir uncertainty and discontent and protest in a way that is unsettling and that raises a call to violence. And that because the way to quell that kind of violence is for other basically Republicans or Fox News even to come out and say, nope, here's the election result, guys. Even if Trump doesn't accept it, like this is what's happening. So we're going to move on now. But if we're in this interim period before everybody agrees that nothing has been called yet, and I don't think that period is likely to last very long, but it could exist. It could be a couple of days theoretically. And that so no Republicans are quelling the violence and Trump is stoking it. And then you wind up with bands of protesters some of whom are armed that travel the country or that rise up in different parts of the country. That to me is a scary, scary outcome. That's doesn't happen in a healthy democracy kind of outcome. So again, I don't think that's likely. I do think it's possible. And I do think it's something we want to try to prepare for and ward against.
Both of you started to touch on, I think, the reality of possibly not having numbers that the night of the election day, though we've been in an election for a month now in many places voting, but on that day, though I think as many of us know, but maybe not everyone who's attending knows that we typically don't have, I don't know if we've ever had certified election results the night of. So some of the narrative and rhetoric that we're getting from the president around needing to have results that night is perhaps unrealistic and just sort of stoking the fire. Can you both talk a little bit about the what if scenario of we don't have results that night and some of that challenging of that process is taking place, perhaps using some examples from Al Gore or other scenarios, but what are some of the things that are, again, logistically happening in that scenario of counting and what are states doing? And just what does it mean for our democracy when that kind of rhetoric is taking place in the kind of timing of results?
So I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So what I'd like to talk about that I think most people don't realize is that America may have the worst election administration system in the industrialized world. And
I'm going to fight you on
that. All right, who's your competitor?
Because not with another country, but I have an argument about why there's a good side to our very strange electoral administration.
I look forward to hearing it, but here's my take. I used to give a lecture called "I'd Rather Vote in Mexico: Structural Flaws in the American Election Administration System." And the reason is that we have 50 different elections running under 50 different rules. And in many of the cases, the state government delegates to local governments, as in Florida, hey, pick any system you like and run it your way. And what that produces is a cacophony of methods. And also something so basic as a national voting registry still eludes us. And we know this is stupid Because when we set up democracies in Japan and South Korea and Germany, Iraq, Afghanistan, we didn't say, hey, why don't you have partisans in the different provinces run the elections? That's a great idea, right? That's not what we advised them to do. It's not what they did. And so what I think is really one of the things that could produce the scenarios you're talking about is that the system, which is underfunded, it's a national mandate that states run badly on many cases, are facing a surge not only in numbers, but in methods. So some states are facing 20 times as many absentee ballots, 20 times as many early votes uh, and mail-in ballots that they've ever had. And they don't have an idea of how to do that. And their laws are not ready. And then you add in pandemic fears. And the majority of the people that work at the polls are often over 50, over 60. So there's just a lot that could go very, very wrong and prevent even as timely a result as we expect in normal American elections.
Okay, so I'll start with the part that I'll fight you on, and then I'll talk about the actual question. So I totally agree with everything you just said, but I want to give you a different way to think about it.
These are the fights
which
I like.
is, which is, we don't have. So, in my mind, the way that governments should be run is that the way the rules are set up should match the way the execution goes. And in the United States, we don't have a national election. We only have state and local elections. We don't use a national popular vote to elect the president. We use the electoral college vote. Of course, that's a stupid system, but it's what we use. It's what the Constitution says, and it's probably not going away anytime soon. So that means we actually should have, in fact, do an electoral administration system that matches the institution. So the institution is dumb, therefore the electoral administration is dumb. And by dumb, I just mean decentralized, right? The good side about our very decentralized system that we've got is that it's very hard to hack, right? Mm-hmm. You do have thousands of different elections and ballot designs and rules and administration procedures and so forth, and all of these different, sometimes state level, but sometimes down to the county level of how these things go. And yes, that's annoying. And it also probably produces a lot of the litigation like you've been talking about as well. That could be a nightmare scenario. But on the other hand, it also makes it really hard for an outsider to fraudulently or affect or hack the election in some systematic way, because in order to do that, you have to figure out how to do it in the thousands of ways that the election is actually run. So it actually increases our security. It probably decreases the sort of the tie between the constituent and the elected person. So in that sort of classic democracy sense, it's not a great system. But I actually think that our administration system matches our ridiculous rules. And that is, in some sense, a good thing, both on the pragmatic side and on the security side, even though if normatively it's a bad thing. Okay, so that's the part that I would fight you on. But to answer the actual question, I would say that we need to make sure that people differentiate between the projected winner and the certified winner, right? So the actual presidential election does not take place on election day, right? Because we have this ridiculous electoral college system. And what happens in the ridiculous electoral college system is that everybody votes on election day, and then the Congress or the electoral college doesn't meet until November, I think it's December, I think it's 14th this year. So it's 6 weeks or so after election day. And even then they're meeting in all the state capitals in various places around the country. So they don't meet as one body. And they're just, they could be nameless people. They're just stand-ins for a popular vote, essentially. But even then, after the electoral college votes, the whole election isn't certified until January when the House of Representatives meets. And the House of Representatives that certifies the election is not the current House of Representatives, it's the new one that gets voted in, right? And so it's this really strange process in a lot of ways. But despite all that, Americans want to know who won the election reasonably, and they want to know fairly close to the time that they cast their ballots reasonably. And so on election day or election night or shortly thereafter, what the media does is they hire a bunch of political scientists and pollsters and data science analysts and so forth that can look at the votes as they roll in. And they do this crazy, it's not crazy, but it's a sophisticated system between looking at the actual votes that are rolling in on the Secretary of State's websites, and the exit polls and the other polling that they have about how a state is going to go. And they use those two things together to make a projected winner. So what we get on election night, what we've always gotten on election night, is not who won the election, but it's the media's projected winner based on all of these totally non-controlled, totally decentralized analysts like me and Jerry, who are out there doing this stuff for the media. And so, but at the same time, that's usually right. And that, those analysts they know what they're doing. And usually those projections turn out to be the exact same thing that gets certified in December and then again in January. The question is, what happens when the vote counting is slow, or there's a difference between what the exit polls say and what the polling says and how the votes are rolling in on the Secretary of State's websites as the states are reporting them? And what if there's incongruencies there, or things are happening that we didn't expect, and how does that get reported? I think that because of what happened in the year 2000, and for those of you that weren't alive back then, it was insane, right? So early in the evening, Florida's called for Gore. Gore has won Florida, and everybody goes, okay, that means, as usually goes, whichever candidate wins Florida wins the election. So, all right, looks like Gore has won this election. And then a couple hours later, they go, oh, no, we got to take that back. We actually think Bush has won. And then a couple hours later, oh, no, we got to take that. We don't know who won, because there's all of these irregularities. And that happened over the course of, between like 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. or whatever. It was really nuts. And then we didn't know, they just kept Florida up in the air for like 5 weeks. And then ultimately it's the Supreme Court that decides, and we could get into what happened after that. But because the media got so burned 20 years ago in that process, they use very conservative standards to make these projected calls. And that should give us a lot of confidence that they're using these conservative standards and they don't want to get caught with their pants down the way they did making the wrong call for Florida in 2020. And so when the media is saying, we project that California will vote for Biden, we project that, Arkansas will vote for Trump, we can have a fair amount of faith, I think, in that. The question for us this year is, when all of those projections come in with all of this data on election night, around midnight or 1 a.m. or so, where are we going to be? A number of states are counting slowly. A number of states are very close. We're not quite sure where we're going to be at that point.
And I also think it's worth warning everyone that there's going to be some blue mirages and red mirages. Blue mirage is a state that presumably looks very Democratic early in the evening, but you shouldn't have faith in it. And that's like North Carolina and Florida, because those two states add their early and their mail-in votes as soon as the polls close. And that vote we expect will favor Democrats. But the in-person votes, which will trickle in later, will favor Republicans, so that Florida could look blue early and turn red. The other red mirages are probably more numerous. Those are states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which by law can't even start counting the mail-in ballots until Election Day. They may not be done by election night or even a couple days after. And there are states like Wisconsin that is going to accept mail-in ballots, I think 6 days after, as long as they're postmarked the day before. And that could, if it's close in Wisconsin, we won't know for more than a week. So if your name is Chad because your dad was a proud Republican in 2000 and hanging Chads took it, we've gotten rid of the Chads for most of the country. So your little brother maybe, or your child may be named digital outcome to be determined.
I do. That the hanging Chad reference may not hit with everybody in our audience. I'm not sure, but I remember that fondly, or maybe not fondly is not the right word. But thank you both for sharing that. I think in a similar vein, one of my what ifs, and again, feel free to share one with each other though, is what happens if the president contests the results and refuses to accept the results of the election?
I think we should essentially expect that's going to happen, unless the early results that come in are favorable to Trump, which frankly, from a political science standpoint, is going to be hard to explain. If we wake up on November 4th and it appears that Trump has won the election,
I'm going to have to go back and look at all of these data that we've been looking at and that pollsters have been using and figure out how to explain why it's gone that way. And actually, I actually have an answer for that, but that's not the question. One of the things to keep in mind is that the act of conceding is not, doesn't have any legal authority in any way. It's a democratic norm. It's one of these democratic norms that we follow because we believe in the fair transfer of power. We believe in the power of elections to determine these outcomes. And once everybody agrees on the rules, one of the democratic norms is whatever outcome the rules have produced is the outcome that the players should accept. It's no different than sitting down and playing a game of Monopoly with your family. If you all agree that free parking doesn't collect money at the beginning, then you can't change the rules halfway through and start all of a sudden making free parking this money windfall, right? Because changing the rules changes the legitimacy of the outcome of the game, right? And so in a democracy, we just agree on the rules beforehand. And when the rules produce an outcome, we agree that that's the outcome we're going to accept. So if it appears that Biden has won the election, if the media has projected Biden to be the winner, even if all the results aren't certified yet, or even if a week later the results get more or less certified by the secretaries of state, if not the official electoral college, and Trump still refuses to concede, that's when we get into a really interesting situation. So the act of not conceding, again, has no legal authority whatsoever. It doesn't change anything. But what we need to look for at that point, I think, are two things. One is this idea of media leadership and elite messaging. So we want to look at other elite Republicans. So Mitch McConnell, I don't know, whoever you think of, the Marco Rubios, the Mitch McConnells, the senators and the governors and the Republican leaders who have a broad spotlight, who would come out and say, Republicans have lost this election, the president is fighting it or doesn't want to concede, but we're going to move on and there'll be a transfer of power in January. And that type of leadership, even though it would contradict the president, would be impactful. And the other element to add into that mix would be Fox News. And a mixture of both the commentators on Fox News and the anchors on Fox News, if they were coming out and saying the president isn't conceding, but it appears he has lost, that would also be a big deal. That would move a lot of minds, I think. So in addition to that elite messaging, though, then the other question is, I guess this goes a little bit back to my nightmare scenario, which again, I think is unlikely. But if President Trump loses and he refuses to concede and sort of stirs up a lot of conspiracy theory and accusations of fraud that are not backed by evidence, importantly, accusations of fraud that are backed by evidence should be heard. Like, that's an important thing that needs to be investigated, because that also threatens democracy. But accusations of fraud that are not backed by evidence are themselves undermining of the democratic process. So the question is not, are people crying fraud? The question is, what evidence are they bringing to support those claims? Because if they're not supported, then that is where it's problematic. And so I lost my train of thought there. But if the accusations of fraud come and there's no evidence behind that, if his core supporters then get up in arms about it, if he is stirring them to some type of action, then I think that's a meaningful and worrisome situation that we would want to think about. I want to add one other thought to this, and that is that protest is okay. It's not that, this is such a tense election and negative partisanship is so heightened right now in the United States that whichever side loses is going to be really disappointed. And depending on what media they listen to, not only are they going to be disappointed, they're going to be shocked because they've been told they're winning, right? And so what people do with that disappointment, though, is important. If you remember, after inaugurated in 2017, Democrats took to the streets. There were mass, gigantic protests. Some of the biggest protests Washington, D.C. has ever seen occurred shortly after that inauguration. But protests themselves are democratic. That is not a problem. It's the violence or the insurrection. It's the, we don't accept this result. This is not my president. It's that type of rhetoric that is much more undermining of democratic institutions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I will say that if you look back on Inauguration Day in 2016, Trump, I think, was actually surprised by how Obama treated him so civilly and treated him so well. And Obama really went out of his way to be generous as his party faced defeat, and so did Hillary Clinton. And Trump would have never done that because that's not in his ethos. I mean, this is a guy who has never once admitted a mistake, let alone a defeat. He's been bankrupt 6 times. Each one was brilliant. Each one was great. He's history's greatest turd polisher. He can try and try and try to turn defeat into victory. And by relentless effort, he often convinces people. So he won't even admit that he lost the popular vote in 2016, which he manifestly did. He won't admit that his inauguration had fewer people than Obama did, which it manifestly did. And here we see the importance of those little fact problems that emerged early in his campaign and his presidency. So what happens if he doesn't concede? Because as Jennifer says, concession isn't required for any of this. The key here is Republicans in the Congress. If, for example, the Senate goes Republican, which is about a 45% chance now, I would say, so stays in Republican hands, they have the power to contest electoral votes. So if Trump is saying Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan were all stolen from me, they were they were red on election night, and a week later the Democrats stole them. If Republicans contest those and one chamber agrees with it, which they could if all the Republicans are as loyal as they were in impeachment, as loyal as they were with this nomination, then you have a real crisis because there is no formal way in law or constitution to resolve when we don't know who won a state. It happened in 1876. And the way they resolved it in 1876 is one of the ugliest chapters in American history because the Democrats probably won. But they set up a commission stacked with Republicans by 1 vote. And so the Democrats cut a deal. They said, okay, we'll let you have the presidency if you take all of your troops, federal troops, out of the South, so it was white Republicans agreeing to take the presidency and white Democrats agreeing that they would take the South back. And the loser there was African Americans. And within 20 years, almost none of them were registered to vote. Hundreds of them were massacred and killed in that bloody deal. I'm not suggesting that's where we're going, but that's the kind of deal that would have to be struck if the Republicans in the Senate, and they're a majority, line up lockstep behind Trump's claims that 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 states, however many he needs to have a victory, were fraudulently stolen from him. I want to make sure that I do agree with Jennifer, that's not a likely outcome. But if you're thinking about what could happen if Trump doesn't concede, it's not important unless he has Republicans at the elite level behind him. By the way, by law, if January 20th noon kicks and we do not have a president, so in other words, if neither side has given up, Nancy Pelosi, assuming she's Speaker of the House, becomes president. So there is that sort of, hey, if you don't win, would you rather have Pelosi than Biden? Because I think a lot of Republicans in their heart of hearts would rather have Biden than Nancy Pelosi.
So with the last night's confirmation of a Supreme Court justice and the fact that we are entering into an election where there could be contested results or complaints of fraud or that are real or not, can you talk a little bit about what has to happen for the Supreme Court to be involved in the election results?
Mm-hmm.
I think partially from the perspective of maybe making people feel better or worse about how likely that is to happen because I know last night's news hit a lot of folks. And so what has to happen for the Supreme Court to be involved?
So you have to have a claim that raises a federal tort or a federal wrong, a violation of the Constitution or of the law, and then it makes its way up through the federal courts to the Supreme Court, and it will move very quickly as it did in Florida in 2000. And so I could imagine very easily that if it's close in a state, that there will be contestations because Jennifer may like the disorganized nature of American election administration, but let me remind you, our neighbor to the north, which is a fairly sizable country, in 2000 managed to do a national recount of the whole electorate in less than 24 hours because the whole electorate uses one form of voting one way and it's run by the national government. We couldn't do a recount in 4 counties in Florida in a month and a half. So If there are challenges in a number of states, they could end up very easily in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with any of that. That's certainly the case. And when you think about it, both sides have an incentive to be litigious. But the fact of the matter is, if you have elections that are decided by courts, you don't have democracy, right? That's literally not how it works. You're supposed to agree. Again, I'm going to use the monopoly analogy. You have to agree on the rules beforehand. And of course, the court cases will be about the rules, but they'll be about the way the rules were executed or implemented. Um, and and if they're not being implemented in a fair way, then that does undercut or invalidate or delegitimize the results. And so, on the one hand, you want to have a judicial path to try to adjudicate those types of questions. On the other hand, if that's the way that the election gets decided regularly, then you don't really have a democratic process because you're not actually having a system of free and fair elections. So, to me, it's helpful to think about the past, although 1876 notwithstanding. The more modern past, I think we've had a number of elections where there is the same incentive to be very litigious, and it hasn't gone that direction. Now, 2020 is totally different. Negative partisanship is much higher. We've got COVID. We've got Trump, which is his whole own wild card about politics. Polarization is stronger. So, it's hard to know exactly how much the past is our guide in 2020 as it used to be. But that being said, when the media comes out and says, Missouri has gone this way, Florida has gone this way, and here's why, and everybody can go onto the Secretary of State websites of those states and see where results are, that does lend a fair amount of credibility to those results, even in the, even if court cases can't happen.
Thank you. So in a slight, not necessarily change of topic, but we have a question from our audience around navigating political conversations after the election. So I imagine there's a handful of ways that you all could go with this, whether that's disagreements, but also talking about facts from the election and how to do that, and what are some of the tools and resources folks can use for navigating those conversations.
Yeah, so I tend to follow a strategy. I used to call it the 3 C's strategy. I don't know if I can remember what my 3 C's were, so maybe it's not a great strategy. But essentially it goes something like this. When you're in a disagreement with somebody about politics along these lines, one of the first things you can do in that conversation is to validate something about what they're saying. Even if you think they're wrong about everything, it can just be about validating their feelings. But find something in what they are saying to make a bridge, to make a point of connection with that person, validate them in some way, a commonality, some kind of commonality. It doesn't have to be factual, although it's great if it is, but if it's not, even if it's an emotional one, find a commonality and use that to build a bridge. And then once you've established that connection, then I think you want to use some sort of corrective device, some sort of evidence that you think this interlocutor will accept. And it's hard to know exactly what that is, without a specific situation. But I think, the USA Today is often seen as sort of a relatively neutral political source of high quality information. There are sources that people can go to. And I mean, when you've got a president that runs out there and says, the mainstream media is all fake news, it's a problem, and it's hard to challenge that. But at some point, data is on our side, and data is on the side of truth. And so if you can find enough resources to sort of challenge a factual claim that's being made with some real evidence, I think that can be quite helpful. But to do it in a way that's gentle and not accusatory, and just be like, well, here's what I know, and here's this evidence that's from this credible source, and to be corrective, just sort of gently corrective in that way, I think can be helpful. And if it's not, and if it's just an antagonistic and I'm pissed off and I want to be pissed off and nothing you can say is going to make me feel better, then that's a conversation you should walk away from.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that my favorite metaphor here is from marriage therapy, that when you have a couple, they can have really strong disagreements for decades, the bickering happy couple. But marriage therapists are increasingly concentrating on the C word of marriages, which is contempt. that if you have a conversation, let's say you only disagree once a month, but the way you disagree shows contempt for each other, it's all over. There's nothing you can do. And so in your conversations, try desperately not to be contemptuous of the other person's passion for Trump, for Biden, for whatever. Don't be contemptuous of their grasp of the facts. Be sympathetic. We have a weird media environment right now. There are people running for Congress nominated by one of our major parties who literally have endorsed QAnon, which is the belief that a secret ring of pedophiles at the highest levels of the Democratic Party and world finance is being run and has been run for decades. That Hillary Clinton was complicit in the rape of children. And
to be clear, it's false.
it is absolutely insane. I think I said that, or at least I implied that.
You implied
No,
thought it was necessary to say.
I'm the QAnon member of our faculty. They brought me in for diversity. No, it is insane. But even with that, I hope you can, because there was a nice piece in the Post last week about someone who was in QAnon, who believed it, and his advice, he'd gotten out, and his advice was not to challenge someone's views directly, but just say, okay, aside from that, how is it helping that you've been in the basement for 2 weeks, online all the time? And sort of, if it's someone you love, come at it a completely different way rather than fruitlessly arguing whether Wisconsin was stolen despite all the data.
Yeah, I totally agree with your marriage therapy analogy there. And I like your non-contempt sort of suggestion. To clarify, my 3 C's are stay calm, offer corrections, and make a connection. Not in that order. Stay calm, then make a connection, then offer corrections. Those are my 3 C's. And then we can add Jerry's, I like his, about being non-contemptuous. Shane is asking a good question in the chat on the QAnon about how do you see increased conspiracy theories being more popular moving forward? And I really like this question. I hope you don't mind, Kristen, if I address it briefly.
I was just going to pose it to both of you, so please address it as non-briefly as you'd like to.
So, we're all really focused on the election right now. This is the pinnacle of this contest that's been going on. But an election day is in some ways not the most important thing, right? And if, I do believe that democracy is on the ballot. Where the Republican Party under Trump has gone over the last 4 years is more towards an authoritarian, anti-democratic, small d, idea about how government in the United States should operate. And I do think that's threatening to our overall system and to the rights and freedoms and privileges of the people who live here. Not because democracy itself is a thing to be regarded, but because it's the only system we've ever created that protects rights and freedoms for people. And so to that end, the problems that are infecting the Republican Party and they're affecting the United States right now, and it's in this dysfunction that we have, are not brought on by Trump or Biden, and they won't be cured by Trump or Biden, right? And so on election day, should Biden win, that will be a good sign for democracy, but it's just to stop the bleeding, right? The actual disease is systemic. It is within our institutions. It's baked into our policies. And so stopping the bleeding is important. That's an important step. And I don't mean to be partisan. I realize that what I am saying is essentially advocacy for a particular candidate. And I want you to know that is not a sense of partisanship, but that's out of a sense of understanding how governments function and how leadership functions within those governments to protect institutions that we know as democracies. And I do think we need to stop the bleeding, but I also think we have a lot of hard work to do. And the stopping the bleeding alone is not going to make things better. We have to look at reforming institutions and reforming policies that are really, really hard. And that's actually way harder than anything going on in this election.
And I think it's also important to say that Jennifer and I would not be saying these things if it was President Rubio. I was really good in 2012 at being even-handed between Romney and Obama. Romney had a policy shop. He had some pretty good ideas. He had some half-baked ones, but some of them were worth fully baking. And the emptiness of Trump's rhetoric is very authoritarian. In other words, there's nothing there. So the Republicans, another norm that Trump broke, they're not running on a platform. They didn't have a platform. You go back to 1832, you just got to have a platform. So where do conspiracy theories come up? Well, we have, I think it's not the media's fault. It's rather the change in the technology of the media. That there used to be this fringe group called the John Birch Society that believed there was a communist conspiracy active in the Eisenhower administration, that Eisenhower was a cooperative or a dunce if he wasn't actually cooperating. And William F. Buckley, God bless him, racist though he was, ran those bastards out of the Republican Party. And now they're back. They're back. Like, I have friends on Facebook from years ago that have just started watching John Birch Society videos that are almost as crazy as they were in the 1950s. So this new media environment, instead of offering us all depth and analysis undreamt of, instead is allowing these QAnon and John Birch Society, and yes, there are some on the left. You know, I spend a lot of time on my Facebook page telling my left-wing friends, hey, that's actually not true. I know Occupy Democrats put it up, but that didn't happen. And it's not, I'm not equalizing. I'm not saying it's both equally wrong on both sides. There's a lot more of it on the right, but it is a product of our media age, and we need to find a way to address it. The media in France did a much better job. Macron faced an avalanche of hacked emails by Russia that were released to their media, and their media didn't bite on them. Their media said, we don't know if these are true. It's very similar to what our media is doing today, except for the New York Post, with the Hunter Biden computer. The Washington Post is asking a very fair question. Show us the hard drive so we can give it to our gearheads and we can find out if it has any truth to it. Oddly enough, Giuliani won't do that. If it was legit, he would do that. He'd be eager to have outside experts look at it. Weirdly, he doesn't want to do that. So we have to stop conspiracy theories. We need to restore a responsible information environment.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I would add that, you know, might not be a totally popular opinion, but I think this is a conversation we're going to be having in the future. Government plays a role there. You know, government is, in the United States, we revere the First Amendment and freedom of speech in really important ways and for really important reasons. But we revere it so much that we make it's gotten to the point where we're using that as a judicial legislative reason to not regulate Twitter and Facebook and the social media environment. When, as Jerry is explaining, the whole problem with an unregulated media environment is that it has the capacity and clearly the productivity to help generate and perpetuate these conspiracy theories. So I do think there is a role to play in media regulation. And you can see back in the late 1980s and the mid 1990s, when we changed media regulation rules about media ownership and equal time laws in the United States, campaigns changed and media ownership changed, and Fox News Corporation was born in a much more dominant way than it had been in the past. We know that media regulation has costs, but we also know that it has huge benefits to pay for democracies. And thinking of Facebook and Twitter and all the rest as just utilities that are just there for people to use, and we need to keep our hands off them, is a democratically defeating attitude. We have to think of them as newspapers or as media outlets that should follow the same sort of professional norms and regulations that any responsible media outlet should follow in curating their content.
So we had a question. We had two questions come in. The first one was, what do you see happening? Two-part really. What do you see happening if the election comes to an electoral college tie? And then if the Senate were to also somehow come to a tie, would Pence be able to vote for himself? So I guess it's sort of a three-part question.
I only caught the first one.
So what happens in an electoral college tie? Yep. And then a Senate tie. And then how does Pence vote in that event?
So
I see. Let me start with.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to quickly address the electoral college tie because it's very straightforward. It's right there in the Constitution. If the electoral college is tied, which again, very low probability event, never happened before. However, this is 2020, so we should talk about it. It's the incoming, not the existing, but the incoming, the 117th Congress each state delegation, each state gets one vote, basically. So there's 435 votes. The House of Representatives would decide the presidential election. Each state delegation gets one vote. So then you would go through the state delegations and look at which are there more Republicans or more Democrats in each delegation. Any delegation that has more Democrats, that's a vote for the Democratic candidate. Any state delegation that has more Republicans, that's a vote for the Republican candidate. There's a nice piece up on the Brookings Institution website right now about electoral college ties. That's pretty straightforward. And the reason we can't fully answer this question right now is because it comes down to some unknowns, as everything does, of course, these days. And the fact of the matter is, if we had an electoral college tie, we would not know the outcome of the presidential election until sometime in January, because we'd have to wait and see how some of those close calls came out, both in terms of the congressional elections and those state delegations, and then which way those state delegations would go.
And if it was very close, I could imagine that there would be somebody in Congress on the Republican side that might take one for the team, for the American team, and not vote for Trump. If he was the deciding vote in their heart of hearts, from reports that I'm sure Jennifer has seen, because she follows Congress more than I do, when there isn't.
I want to remind you.
Yeah.
That in 2016, we had more electoral college defectors that year than we'd ever had before. There were I think 7 defectors that year. And most of those defectors were Clinton defectors, not Trump defectors. I'm just throwing that out there.
I think, I'm not saying that, we're talking the unlikely. So triple the unlikely, and that might happen. But Pence would not have a vote, because what the question is referring to is the House picks the president, the Senate picks the vice president. So his question is quite clever. If there were a tie in the Senate 50-50, the vice president usually clears that or breaks that tie, but there would be no vice president. So there would be no way to break that. Just as if the House went 25-25, there is no way to break that. So we would have to sit and wait and vote again and again and again and wait for a Democrat or Republican to crumble. And good luck.
It would be like the election of 1800, because that turned out so well.
But at least we get a great musical out of that. I mean,
yeah, that way.
Hamilton, this could be.
You have to wait like 115 years.
It was worth the wait. It was worth.
Yeah, I give you that.
So it becomes like finding a pope. We just have to wait for some sort of consensus.
Yeah, they should do that with
one of those spaces.
That would be great if they had released smoke over Capitol Hill when the dark smoke that we know, or white smoke is the decision. I'm not a Catholic, but I hear.
That's right.
We had another question that very specifically was asking about whether Jeffrey Epstein's death had anything to help with the QAnon message getting traction. But I sort of want to say more broadly, you can speak about that if you like, but also more broadly, what are some of the things that are really contributing to this conspiracy theory notions getting the traction they are? Is it the polarization? Is it the desire to clamor on something? Is it the media? I mean, what are some of the roots of it? And how do you hope maybe that could change in the future?
So I would
I want to start by saying,
you first.
We keep talking over each other. Say something very, very brief. We know a couple of things about environments in which conspiracy theories are likely to germinate and gain traction. And those environments are ones in which people are actually knowledgeable. So sometimes people have the idea that conspiracy spread by people who don't know anything and they're just, making stuff up and believing it. But that's actually not the case. Most people who believe in conspiracy theories are knowledgeable people. They're smart people. It's not that it's a low information or a low knowledge or a low education kind of population in which these things germinate. But what happens is you've got just enough information, but also so you've got information, you've got wide uncertainty. That's the second big ingredient. So huge uncertainty about what's going on and costs that go along with polarization and so forth. And then you've also got, wait, I lost it. You've got the uncertainty, the knowledge, and you have, I just lost my train of thought. I had a really good point that I was going to make there. It was going to tie the whole thing together. Jerry, say something quick and it's going to come to me.
So I think, to build on that, conspiracies come from the complexity of the world and people's fear and confusion over what happened. And I think one of the things that in addition to the media that gives a megaphone, like a guy at the bar believing in the John Birch Society didn't have a megaphone. Now He has a megaphone on Facebook or Twitter or wherever. But one big reason is that the middle class has been stagnant in this country and the American dream isn't working out. And at the same time, growing levels of inequality so that the 1%, which you read about, that you see on your TV screens, the Kardashians, all this unimaginable wealth is being popped. And so that burning anger, and then the failure of elites. So the war in Iraq, where we were told that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, we were told that he was buddy-buddy with Al-Qaeda, and then Americans went there and found nothing, and people died, and we spent $3 trillion, which could have been a free college education for every damn American, as well as free healthcare. And we didn't get any. And add on to that, I'm going to rant for a moment here. Wall Street collapses in 2008, and there's criminal fraud, and Wall Street recovers before anyone else. In fact, there's American families that are still struggling from what happened to their savings. And this is Obama's failing. They did not bring criminal charges against any of the firms or any of the major people involved in that colossus. In fact, we held more people to account for the collapse of 1929 than we did the great collapse of 2008. So elites are running high over the hog, and poor people and middle class people are doing worse and worse. Why not think of a conspiracy?
Yeah, so I'll just add to that the other thing that winds up feeding a sense of conspiracy, and this ties into some of what Jerry was just saying, is a sense of cynicism. When people are sort of poised or predetermined to just be really skeptical about the world, if you're knowledgeable, uncertain, and skeptical, that was my third thing, you're much more likely to believe in conspiracy theory. So it's worthwhile to develop a little bit of self-awareness. Are you knowledgeable? Are you feeling really uncertain about the world? Are you feeling highly skeptical about the world? You are vulnerable to believing conspiracy theories. So when you start thinking stuff is true, check it. Find ways of verifying the things that you believe across multiple sources and across sources that use good techniques for making inference and to see if what you are believing is in fact true.
I think that's really helpful in the context of, really where we are right now going into this election. And you both, I think, put really well that doesn't just wrap up after, no matter what the results are. We're coming close to our time. And what I want to give you both the chance to do is kind of share one thing that you would want to tell. And again, I believe we have a mostly student audience, but a Mason audience. One thing that you would want to tell folks who are worried about the election outcomes, or stressed, one thing you want to tell them, something that either maybe answers some questions, it may give calm or it might not, but something you want to tell them. And then is there anything that you think folks can do right now to maybe address some of those fears they may have?
Oh, now you want me to talk.
I will go first if you want me to. So I will say that if you want to do something, if you want to feel better about this election and you want to have hope, young people are the hope. The turnout jump among young people in 2018 was sizable. There's some early indicators that it's even larger this year. And I think there was a lot of remorse among young people that if you look at vote in 2016, Hillary did well among the young, Trump did well among the old, but turnout among the old was higher, as it always is. And the same situation in the UK months before Trump wins. Brexit, the people who are going to live a shorter lifespan in this new free Britain were for Brexit, but the people who are facing 70 years of living under this maybe bad idea were against it, but their turnout wasn't very high. So there is a hope I have that there's going to be a new generation of activism, and maybe we will replenish the roots of our democracy through the turmoil that we are undergoing now, and we may undergo even worse after this election.
Yeah, I second that. And there's good evidence that you look at the turnout statistics from the 2018 midterm election, and what Jerry just said is actually totally borne out there. Of all the age demographic groups, the young voters between 18 and 25 are the ones that increased their participation rates by leaps and bounds over the previous midterm election. So there really is reason to think that it's the young activists and the young voters that are going to get us out of this mess through their participation. I want to add two things. One is as a way to help lower your blood pressure if you're really worried about what's happened, is the concept of Occam's razor. And if you're not familiar with it, go Google it. But basically, the concept of Occam's razor is that the simplest explanation is usually true, right? So don't overthink things too much. The things that are most likely to happen generally happen. This PTSD from 2016, because we got the low probability event is the one that actually occurred and actually had significant consequences for everything. It's okay to be traumatized by that, but in general, usually the simplest explanation is the true one, and the high probability event is the one that occurs, right? So if you're a gambler, this might not work for you, but if you're not, it might be of some comfort. The other thing that I would say is over the last, this is getting a little bit too personal, but over the last like 5 years or so, I've discovered a little bit of Buddhism that I think is actually kind of awesome. And I'm not a religious person, to be totally frank. But if you want to feel better about who you are in this world and how this world is and your place in this world, there's two things that I think Buddhism helps us understand really do improve your outlook on life. And they are generosity and gratitude. Something to be thankful for, recognize it, acknowledge it, say it out loud, show your gratitude in some way, and find some way to be generous towards others. If you can help other people, whether it's helping them vote or helping them buy groceries or helping them whatever, send an email, whatever it is, just helping people and showing gratitude towards them, anything can be okay if we're doing those two things.
Thank you both. I know I learned a lot from the conversation, and again, I think what I've maybe felt for the last month is better and worse all at the same time. So I think maybe that's a very common feeling we all are experiencing. But I want to thank you both for sharing your evening with us and with our group. And I also want to share a few reminders before we wrap up with our group that if you haven't voted yet and you are registered in the state of Virginia, the last day for early vote is this Saturday, and it ends at 5 as a note, and then it's election day on Tuesday, November 3rd is the other option at that point. If you are not a Virginia voter and you are looking for information to either confirm your registration, confirm your polling location for early voting or day of voting, and to read information about the down ballot issues, because we spent a lot of time talking about the presidential election. But there is so much information on your ballot, regardless of where you're voting. Vote411.org is a really good resource for that. You can craft your ballot before you even get to the poll. I know I did that for my early voting. So I was, given that it's a pandemic, I was in and out, done circling my ballot in like a minute because I knew everything I was doing before I got there. So I really, really recommend doing that, especially if you want to make sure that you're in and out of the polls quickly when you vote, if you vote in person. And if you visit masonvotes.gmu.edu, which I'll put in the chat also, we have a number of pre-election events that are still remaining, but we've actually scheduled a number of elections for sort of, I shouldn't necessarily say, or a number of events, not necessarily post-election, but for after November 3rd, that are both going to be spaces for processing the results with folks if you feel like you need a space to do that. And then also some spaces that are going to really be speaking like educationally about what happened. Dr. Victor is one of those events. She'll be opening her class up to folks to join. So if you want to hear more from Dr. Victor on Thursday, November 5th, at 10:30 a.m. I believe is the time. There's a Zoom link that'll be on the Mason Votes website. She'll be sort of breaking down what we know, whatever it is we know at that point, what we know. She'll be talking a little bit about that. But there's a number of other events there. So masonvotes.gmu.edu. If you're really interested in more events before November 3rd and after November 3rd, we have a lot of different programming that's going on. So again, reminder to vote. If you have questions about voting, masonvotes.gmu.edu is also a really great resource, especially if you're voting and registered and plan to vote on campus in Merton Hall on election day. There's information about that there too. So thank you again to Dr. Victor and Dr. Mayer. We really appreciate you both being with us, and thanks to all of you for joining. We're so glad that you spent your evening with us.
Thanks everyone, great to be with you.